This is apropos. Well, Israel is being accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, including massive forced displacements that amount to ethnic cleansing. A new report from the New York-based group Human Rights Watch says civilians have been killed while evacuating under Israeli orders and in Israeli-designated humanitarian zones. It says the demolition of homes and infrastructure in Gaza is likely to permanently displace many Palestinians. Israel has condemned the findings of the report as completely false and detached from reality. Emerald Maxwell has the details.
War crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. That's what Human Rights Watch says Israel's forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza amounts to in a new 172-page report. For those living that reality, displaced in fear and grieving their loved ones, it's too little, too late.
Yesterday we had 20 martyrs, the day before we had 30, and every day there are 30, 100 martyrs. What can I say? Is the world not seeing this? The whole world can see what's going on in Gaza.
It's true that the Human Rights Watch report condemned the Israeli infringements and the forced displacements. However, it has come late.
The report is the latest in a series from international bodies warning about the dire humanitarian situation in the enclave. Human Rights Watch says their findings are based on interviews, satellite imagery and public reporting conducted until August 2024, before Israel's intense offensive in northern Gaza since early October.
Given this evidence, including the sheer number of Palestinian civilians in Gaza driven from their land and the manner of displacement, and the attempts to make this return impossible, the forced displacement is widespread, systematic and intentional, and forms part of a state policy and amounts to a crime against humanity.
The report points in particular to the Philadelphia and Netzarim corridors, which it said Israel had raised to ensure they will remain permanently emptied of Palestinians.
Human Rights Watch finds these actions of the Israeli authorities amount to ethnic cleansing.
Israeli authorities have previously rejected such accusations and say the displacement of Gazans is justified for their safety or by military imperatives. Human Rights Watch called on governments to suspend military aid to Israel and recommended that the International Criminal Court investigate the forced displacement and prevention of the right to return as a crime against humanity.
To discuss in detail the findings of that report, we're joined now by Nadia Hardman from the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Nadia, thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening. You featured in that report from Emerald, you referred in it to forced displacement, describing that as a crime against humanity. Just talk to us about some of the evidence that you've collected suggesting that this is happening in Gaza.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. The report, it's 154 pages. It's a massive amount of evidence, which essentially unpacks and debunks Israel's claim that it is evacuating people safely. We essentially analyze the laws of war, which set out how an occupying power can evacuate a population if there is an imperative military reason and if it's for their security. And what we demonstrate is that these claims are largely false. And those reasons are because people were never moved safely. The evacuation system was filled with errors, was inconsistent, and put people in harm's way. As your clip already showed, people were attacked on evacuation routes and in safe zones. The Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, where Israel has told people to go for their safety, has changed its boundaries at least 14 times. On top of that, the humanitarian situation is dire, as we know, in Gaza. Famine is imminent in North Gaza. And one of the conditions, if you want to move people lawfully under the laws of war, is that you have to provide them with water, food, shelter, not separate families. Instead, what we've seen is starvation being used as a weapon of war. And as I said, just massive needs that are not being met by the restrictions on humanitarian aid. And lastly, it must be temporary. People must be able to return to their homes. But instead, we've seen the widespread destruction in Gaza, which has rendered the Strip largely uninhabitable through reckless and intentional destruction, especially in these buffer zones and corridors where Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed from these lands.
And Human Rights Watch is calling for the displacement of civilians to be investigated by the International Criminal Court. Is that something that's likely to happen, do you believe?
I mean, it's impossible for us to predict the actions of the prosecutor. All we can do is put forward our evidence in the public domain and hope that it's used. But our recommendation is to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate forced displacement as a crime against humanity, but also the prevention of the right to return as a crime against humanity as well. There are a list of recommendations, and we're also calling on states to publicly condemn Israel's actions and also to suspend military assistance and weapons transfers. These violations are ongoing and they're urgent.
And you also want targeted sanctions to be imposed on Israel. What exactly would that entail? What's the best way to go about that?
I mean, these are also for individual states to decide and make their decisions over who and how to sanction. We also recommend that bilateral agreements should be revisited and negotiated in the context of what is happening. Really, states have all available methods to use leverage, but really to draw a line under these massive human rights abuses.
And this, Nadia, it's just the latest report on the conduct of Israeli forces in Gaza. What should the international community be doing at this point?
I mean, there's so much information out there. This is not an uncovered conflict. The devastating news gets worse every day. UN agencies are continually warning of just the catastrophic situation that Palestinians in Gaza face now and have been facing for over a year. Really, Biden had this 30-day deadline, which passed the other day, and we saw no action. And again, we've isolated various recommendations in the report, some of which I've said here. And military assistance, suspending that would do a great deal in terms of influencing Israel's behavior in this regard.
And the US, it claimed today that Israel, it's taken steps to increase aid to Gaza. The UN, though, saying that aid to the northern parts of the territory are at their lowest level in a year at this point. So what is actually happening on the ground?
I mean, I'm not on the ground, doing this incredibly difficult work to coordinate logistical humanitarian assistance. I mean, what we know is that missions are continuously denied, access is continuously denied to North Gaza. And literally just a few days ago, the integrated food classification system warned of famine in North Gaza imminently. And that will happen if things don't change, if trucks aren't allowed to get in, if missions aren't allowed to go forward. I mean, it is just an absolute nightmare for humanitarian agencies operating in Gaza right now. And this can and should change immediately.
But with a Trump presidency looming in the US, you referred to Joe Biden's administration earlier. What kind of pressure can realistically be placed on Israel?
I mean, public condemnation obviously is one thing. Statements, are just statements. But the suspension of weapons transfers, I mean, that's an easy, obviously not easy to implement, but it is a decision that can be made that would influence behavior.
And rights groups as well, it's mentioned in your report, they're warning Israel's building infrastructure to support what looks like a prolonged military presence in Gaza. Did you suggest, or has your group uncovered evidence to suggest that this is actually the case?
I mean, what we've spent a lot of time documenting and analysing satellite imagery over are these buffer zones and extended security corridors. The Netzarim corridor, which bifurcates now the north and the south, and keeps on extending, by the way, to the north and south of Wadi Gaza. The Philadelphia corridor on the border with Egypt, and the buffer zone all around the buffer between Gaza and the border between Gaza and Israel. These areas keep extending, and the land has been raised and cleared of infrastructure, of buildings, and cleansed of people. What we see instead are military outposts in these areas. And, you can't see from satellite imagery any evidence of civilians in these places. They've, as I said, been ethnically cleansed from these areas. And it looks quite clear if you couple that with the statements that we've collected in the report, the statements from senior Israeli officials, which really goes to the systemic nature of these war crimes. The crimes against humanity angle is because it is underpinned by a state policy, that there is an intention to displace people and to prevent their return.
Nadia, thank you so much for your time on the programme with us this evening. That is Nadia Hardman from the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division of Human Rights Watch.